We are good. Okay. Good morning, Star Trek. Welcome to the first talk of today. I'm so glad you're here. I'm really excited about this. I am Matt Eland. I teach programming professionally at Tech Elevator, and when I'm not doing that, I do a lot of things for fun with data science. So much, actually, that Microsoft said, hey, Matt, you're now a Microsoft MVP in artificial intelligence. So that was pretty cool. What I love about this talk is I get to marry those two things together, and I get to talk to you about programming and data science sort of together in a new type of application, well, relatively new type of application called a notebook. Okay? So this talk is about Jupyter Notebooks and Polyglot Notebooks, what a notebook is, what we can do with them, why we do want to do that, that kind of thing. This talk has 0 slides associated with it, so everything you're seeing here is available for you to pull from GitHub. You can go out to my GitHub at github.com/integerman/polyglot notebooks talk. I also put this in our Discord, and I will tweet this and put it on LinkedIn as well after the talk. So everything we're going over, you'll be able to run on your own, assuming you can get through the setup steps, and I'll walk you through that as well. But my goal is to show you really what we can do with Jupyter Notebooks and with Polyglot Notebooks and why we would do that. So I'm going to be stressing less the individual lines of code and more the breadth of what we can do with these really fun technologies. Okay? So let's just jump right on into it. So we were in a notebook before, but this is another notebook. And here I have a series of cells. And if I double click on a cell in VS Code, I get to see, well, this is just Markdown. Right? So these cells are just Markdown cells that I can run by hitting Control Enter, and I can edit, and I can say, hello, Star Trek, and I get just lovely stuff there. Okay? But you can mix together Markdown cells and code cells. And Jupyter Notebooks stands for Julia, Python, and R. So we have 3 different kernels built into a Jupyter Notebook. You have the Julia kernel, you've got the Python kernel, and you've got the R kernel. Now, I don't know R very much. I know the indexes of arrays start at 1, and so I don't like it as much as I like Python. And I don't know Julia at all, so I'm going to be showing you only Python today as far as our Jupyter Notebooks go. When we go into Polyglot Notebooks, I'm going to show you a lot more languages and technologies. But this is a code cell down here. This is a code cell that I can put in some content in here, so I can say, let's just declare a variable. I'm going to say this is conference is Star Trek, and the year is 2023. And I'll hit Control Enter or click the little play button, and it runs that. And that's okay, I guess, but I can also put in some things here to print out some values. So I can say print, I can say conference, and then str to convert our integer to a string, and it says Star Trek 2023. So anything that we print out to the console in a notebook gets printed out below the individual cell. The advantage of this is that you can have multiple Markdown cells and multiple code cells in the same notebook, and so you can kind of intersperse the code that's running and the documentation that supports it, really making some interactive documentation that people can interact with, tweak configuration settings if they want to, etc. So there's a lot of value to that. Typically, you run your notebooks top to bottom, but you don't necessarily have to. And things that you declare in one cell, you can actually refer to in other places. So here I have this counter variable. I set it to 0. I can refer to it in the next cell. It says, hey, counter is plus equal to 1. The current count is 1. If I rerun this keeps incrementing every time I run it. And I can even go back and I can run the last one and reset it back to 0, which is pretty cool. Now, you can also take a look at what all the variables that are running in your kernel are. So here I'm in VS Code. I have this little variables thing. I see I've got my conference, I've got my counter, I got my year. I see all of my variables, their types, and their values, which is a really nice thing for you to be able to see while you're debugging stuff. So as a teacher, I like this immediately because one of the things that's hard about learning programming, learning new languages is, well, you might write a function or a method, but you have to call that and wait to the end of that method to see if it worked. And this, you can write little bits and pieces of code and see what it does as it does it. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Okay. You can also, if you want to, you have the option to clear all the outputs for everything. You can run your entire notebook, and if things are going wrong, you can always restart your notebook, which happens sometimes. So that's the core of what a notebook is. We're going to see some of the things you can do to make notebooks a little bit more effective. So Python has functions. So here I have an even or odd function. I can define it here. And in the subsequent cells, I can just invoke this. So 41 is odd, and 42 is even. Okay? So I can run little things that refer from one cell to the next. Now, one thing that's going on here is that I don't actually have a print statement here. There is no statement here for me to print anything out to the console. The reason why that I'm now seeing 42 is even as a string below that is that there's a convention in these notebooks where if the last value of a cell is a variable, so here we're going to say password equals fuzzy bunny, super secure, and I end my cell with password, it just prints out that value. Now, if you don't have like just the variable name at the end, it's not going to print out anything out. But that's a nice little convenience thing to prevent you from having to do a lot of print statements and display calls or things like that. So very handy capabilities. Python, of course, has classes. And so if you want to work with classes, you can declare your own class. So here is, actually I had Bing Chat generate this. But this is a FizzBuzz class in Python that's going to, it has a generate method, and it's going to generate a sequence of numbers from 1 to whatever, with fizz and buzz as the classic interview problem goes. So here I can declare that class, instantiate it, and call it with a parameter here of 5. And it's going to say 1, 2, fizz, 4, buzz. So we can have full applications really running in a Jupyter notebook. For me, whenever I wanted to do little experiments before, I would make a console application, or I'd make a desktop application, or maybe even a web application. Nowadays, as I've gotten into notebooks, I'm finding myself, if I want to do a little experiment, play with something new, I create a notebook because I don't need to ship it to production. I just want to see how it behaves. And so creating a new notebook to play around with something or just to generate a result, I find this is a very effective way of quickly getting into something, sharing something, and learning and sharing new things with other people. So I really love notebooks. Now, not everybody wants to have all of their code in the same file. So, for example, I have a fib.py, the Fibonacci. This calculates the largest Fibonacci number up to a given number. Okay? So here I have an n parameter, and what we're going to do here is we are going to go up to that number, and we're going to print out the largest number up to that. So I can invoke this over here. So from fib, that's my fib.py file, import largest Fibonacci, and I can call it. And it says the largest Fibonacci number up to and including 5 is 3. Well, uh-oh, that's not right. The largest Fibonacci number up to including 5 is actually 5. So if I go back into fib.py, I can go in and I can make a change here. I can say, oh, that should be less than or equal. Save that file. And I go back in over here to my calling scripts. I run it again. I still get a 3. This is one thing I want to highlight with Jupyter, is sometimes you'll need to restart your kernel for it to actually reload these files. In this case, it's kind of cached what my guy was. Yes, I do want to restart my kernel. Thank you very much. And now I should be able to run it again and I get the correct answer. So little gotchas with working with scripts. You can import your own stuff. That works just fine. Most of the time, you'll want to import stuff that other people have written. For example, there's a lovely library out there called Pandas, which lets me work with data tables, data frames we call them. And I can work with tabular data there, and I can see what's going on there. Okay, so here I've got this command to import pandas as PD. That's not going to work if I haven't installed pandas on my environment. So the way we install dependencies in Jupyter Notebooks is we do a pip install. There are 2 different pip installs we can do, though, and it's a little confusing because there's a % pip install, and then there's a bang pip install, or exclamation mark. The difference between the two is that the % one installs it into the current virtual environment, while the bang one is the not recommended one, which is why we have this little red underline there. But it installs it into your base Python environment. Usually you don't want to use this, you want to use the % one instead. But once we have that dependency installed, we're able to go in there and we're able to just print out here our data frame, which is a list of numbers from Lost. By the way, I don't find myself often installing new packages when I'm doing these things because I use a data science package called Anaconda. Anaconda comes pre-configured with Jupyter Notebooks, Jupyter Labs, which is a more advanced form of Jupyter Notebook, or more advanced web interface for it, and then a series of other libraries and environments that you might need to do data science experiments with it, which is really handy. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple examples of using a Jupyter Notebook for more intense stuff. So here is an example of using Pandas for data processing. So here I took a Titanic.csv file. This is a data set full of people who lived and died on the Titanic. And I loaded it up into a data frame. We see that data frame right here. It's a tabular data structure. And I can kind of look at the first 5 rows with this head call. Right? So I'm able to do pandas read CSV. I'm able to say dataframe.head and take a look at all these things. And I can start to explore my data with that. There's also a tail that shows me the last 5 rows. And this actually highlights an issue here where we have rows that are completely not a number. So we're able to do things like going in and dropping rows that have not a number in them. We're able to go in and do descriptive statistics and correlation analysis and all these really complex, cool things with the Pandas library. This is what I do a lot with this library, is as I will look at these tabular data sets and I will transform them and customize them and get them to the state that I need for either data visualization or machine learning or application development. You can also do little things like renaming columns. You can transform values. So here, for example, the embarked column had C, Q, or S, and I'm like, okay, that doesn't make sense to me. And, oh, okay, I can map Q to Queenstown. All right. Pandas is really good for just sort of transforming your data, and doing this inside of a Jupyter Notebook lets you do it very iteratively. So I say, hey, what's my data look like now? And so you're not building an application from start to finish. You are doing little experiments and you're adding on to it. And this is part of why I like notebooks so much, is because you can do these little iterative experiments and build on each one as time goes on. Okay? I'm not going to highlight everything here because we don't have time for that. But I really, really, really love the Pandas library for being able to add in calculated columns, drop things that don't make sense, clean your data, understand your data a little bit. And when we're done, we can actually save the resulting data set to a new CSV file. So here I've got this Titanic process CSV, and I'm able to open this guy up over here in my next notebook. So even though notebooks are sort of separated from each other, you can have them write data to disk or to a database, and you could read it in the next subsequent notebook, which is pretty neat. Okay, so here I've got my data visualization notebook. There's a lot of different ways of doing data visualization in Python. There's just so many of them. I'm going to show you some charts here from my favorite one of these, which is Plotly Express. So Plotly Express gives you the ability to get these really nice charts with just a single line of code. So here I'm saying, hey, I'd like to see a histogram. Here's the data frame I want you to generate a histogram for. Here's what I want your x-axis to be, and I also want you to segment it by colors. And it says, okay, well, here are the people on the Titanic. There are a lot of people here in their 24 to 26 year range. Many of them survived. Oh, sorry, blue is did not survive. Whoopsies. Many of them did not survive, but plenty of them did. And so you can sort of look at this and explore the nature of your data, right? And this is what I love about notebooks, is I can start visualizing my data. My data ever changes, I just rerun my notebook, and I'm getting updated visualizations with the new data. So I do a lot of this stuff. You can change the size of the bins. There's actually a whole lot of control you can have over Plotly. But I love it because I get these nice interactive visuals. So here I've got a box chart, a box plot. And I can get like, hey, who's the oldest female on the boat? Or tell me about this particular data point. I can even customize what data shows up when I hover over something. And if you want to show more than just a standard box plot, well, you have the option of showing all of your data points on there. This gets a little overwhelming, but it might make sense for certain data sets. So you get to see more of a distribution of your data, which is what I'm often looking for when I'm doing my data analysis. There's also violin plots that are supported if you want a more sleek look to your data. There's just a lot of stuff that's supported out of the box in Plotly that you can do in about a single line of code. But bear in mind, you're going to have to do some Googling of like, oof, I don't like that it added this axis over here, this legend. How do I customize this? How do I do this? So I do a lot of Googling while I'm doing this stuff, and that's okay. This is all about experiments versus building a working application that you ship out to production necessarily. But once you have something that's polished, you can share it with other people on your team. They can derive value from it. And future you can come back to it next quarter and say, hey, how does this look like with our new data, with our new client, or whatever it might be? So I really love working with data notebooks. They're really fantastic to work with. And so here's another visualization. You can add a box plot inside of a violin if you want that. I don't know why you would want that, but you could have that if you want it. And you just like, hey, show me more axes. Show me more ways of sifting through my data. It's a really great way of understanding your data in a very quick, iterative way that you can then share with other people. So, and they have things like a 3D scatter plot that are just like interactive, and it's actually pretty incredible the stuff you can do with this library with just a little bit of code. So very much a fan of Plotly Express. I have some more content coming out of this on a couple weeks from now, but this is just really good stuff. Of course, you can do line charts, area charts, things like that. So here's an area chart showing our survivorship by age. And all we're doing here is we're saying, hey, Plotly Express, give me an area chart. Here's my data. Here's my x-axis. Here's my y-axis. Just go ahead and plot it for me. And so here we can see that this axis here is high survivorship. So people who were earlier on in age tended to survive more. People who were in their, let's say, 12 to 15, 16, 18 had a pretty good survivorship rating. And then kind of this trend of the older you got, the better you got, until you got in your 70s, and then nobody wanted you to survive. That's what the data says. The data says that people also don't like teenagers very much. 10 to 13, you had a very low rate of success. That's what I get from looking at the data. Sorry, that's just my inferences from the Titanic. Bar charts are great. So here's a bar chart of survivorship by passenger class. We can see a lot of cool stuff here. And you can use this to make very effective data visualizations. So here, this is just a little bit of code to generate a graph that's just pretty effective. If I'm using this to communicate to, the CIO or CTO, something like that, I'm probably doing a little bit more work to make sure I'm not saying passengers in 1.5 class on that axis, and I'm customizing it a little bit more. But Plotly can do that. There's a lot of things that we can do with a little bit more work. If you want to get into hierarchical data, you can do that. So there's tree maps as well. So I can say, hey, of people who got on the boat in Southampton who were in second class, how did they tend to survive? Well, the males had a survivorship rating of 13%, and the females had a survivorship rating of 87%. Okay, well, what about in Queenston? And you can kind of get into that and do that iteratively with your data. So this really is a great way of exploring everything that you care about. And of course, there's even more things. So anything you can do in a tree map, you can also do in the sunburst, which is just this most absurd visualization I've ever seen. But it's the same data, it's just in a nested pie chart. So here I can say Cherbourg and the second class. Yeah, if you were female, you're going to survive if you're in there. If you're male, you got about a 30% chance. So very cool library, very cool way of looking at your data and maybe even potentially checking into source control, sharing it with your team. This is what I love about this. I have some more examples on machine learning. I'm going to skip those just to make sure we have time to talk about Polyglot Notebooks. Before I do that, though, I want to show you, I've been showing you this in VS Code. you can run a Jupyter Notebook in so many different IDEs. PyCharm, DataSpell, VS Code, the list goes on. There's so many of these things out there. But you can also just run a web server that's just a Jupyter Notebook. And if you want to get started with this really quickly, just go out and install Anaconda. It's free. And it includes a Jupyter Notebook installed with it. So here I am in my browser looking at localhost, and I've got a sample Jupyter Notebook here. And this is just running on my machine. And it's a web page, so you can see you can host this Jupyter Notebook on the web, and you and your team and the people that you're interacting with can go out and explore and see everything that's going on. There's also Jupyter Lab. Jupyter Lab has a few more features than Jupyter Notebook, but it's the same core concept, so we get a little bit more of a customizable user interface, so I can use my dark theme, yes. But we got the same stuff, right? All of this is something that you can share with your team and host on an internal server or even a public server necessarily, and you can work with it. There's also things like Azure Machine Learning Studio has a notebook, so you can host a Jupyter Notebook in Azure that can securely talk to your resources out there, right? It can even do your data science experiments in the cloud using RBAC and all the secure stuff that you're used to at an enterprise level. So this stuff can really scale pretty heavily up there, but you can also just run it right out of VS Code, and that's a great way of working with this stuff. Okay. So I'm going to shift gears in a second here, and we're going to get into Polyglot Notebooks, which is much newer and really exciting. Okay, so that wasn't too much of a gear shift. Here I am in a different notebook inside of VS Code. You'll notice the icon is a little bit different. This is a .dib file instead of a .ipynb file. IPy notebooks are data science notebooks, and DIB files, I don't know what DIB stands for, but they are also data science notebooks. The difference is that the IPy notebooks store the results of all prior runs. So they're storing not just the code, but they're also storing the results of that. So even though I don't have internet connection here, I'm able to show you things that I've run before with internet connection. You're going to get to see it. DIB is small. They don't have that. They just store the code, right? Most of the time I'm doing DIB nowadays with my Polyglot Notebooks. But Polyglot Notebooks is a product that Microsoft offers us for free that offers a new kernel into Jupyter Notebooks. Remember, Jupyter Notebooks is this thing that gives us all these kernels that can run code cells. This new kernel is called .NET Interactive, and what it lets us do is run our C# code, our F# code, our JavaScript code, HTML, SQL, PowerShell, custom query language, and a Mermaid diagramming language. All these things can be run in this new .NET Interactive kernel, and it's really exciting. This .NET Interactive kernel can be added to Jupyter Notebooks, so if you have a Jupyter server up there, you can install this kernel into Jupyter Notebooks. And the Polyglot Notebooks extension incorporates into Visual Studio Code. This is the recommended way of working with a data science notebook in .NET or JavaScript or HTML is to use the Polyglot Notebooks extension. That's where most of the love is going to come into this, though it does support integrating into a Jupyter Notebook if you wanted to. But let me just sort of show you what we can do here. But anybody familiar with .NET here in the audience? Okay. Anybody notice a .NET language not listed here? VB is not supported. VB is not supported here, yeah, I don't think it's high on anybody's priority list to add. So that was interesting to me when I saw this. But here we go. We've got a C# code. So I'm declaring a class called a point. I'm going to actually get rid of some code here, but I got a point here that has an X and a Y. I'm able to refer to it on the next code line and just instantiate it. And what's really cool about this is I've got this little X and Y here. It's showing me all the public properties of this object. I can go in here and I can add back in my Z and rerun these two cells. And now, even though I'm not specifying a Z property for this new object I'm creating, because it's a public property on the object, I see its results automatically at the end of the cell. So any object you give this, it's going to just show you, hey, here's what I see in this. Here's the public properties I see on this with getters. Right? If you want to work with methods, you have that availability. So here I've got this calculate favorite number, which is returning 42, because of course it's my favorite number. And I can invoke this as I want. So we have the ability to work with classes. We have the ability to work with functions or methods. So this is great. In fact, we're going to see a lot of the things we can do in .NET you can do here. So you might be thinking, oh, okay, so this is just for people who want to do their notebooks in a different language other than Julia, Python, or R. And the answer is yes, but it's a broader picture than that. The vision for this product is you should be able to work with whatever language is most appropriate for what you're trying to do. You should be able to use SQL to query your database and get raw data. You should be able to take that and then move it to C# or F# if you wanted to, and do some processing on that with your domain logic or some NuGet package out there that's interesting to you. And then you should be able to transform that and take that data out of there and put it into a D3.js data visualization. Right? That's the idea of this product, is they want to be able to take things from one technology to the next, to the next, to the next, if you need to do that. Or you can be like me and just do Markdown in C# all the time and some Mermaid Diagrams in there too. It supports that too. But the vision of this product is to let you work with the languages that are most appropriate for what you're trying to do, to pass data from one language to another. Okay? Sorry, soapboxing aside here, let's get into some more things we can do. We've got the ability to import some code. So here I have got a person class defined in a person.cs file. I'm able to import that using this magic command. I'm just doing pound bang import, and I'm telling it what file I want to import. And now I have everything in that file available to me here to instantiate. So here I'm instantiating a new person, and it is Janelle Doe. Okay? This runs on .NET 7 right now, so I can actually drop this and do the new target type new in C# 11, and that works fine. So this has, you know, all of our newer language features are available to us here in VS Code, and you even get some nice IntelliSense, though it can kind of lag behind a little bit as you're doing things. Right? Okay, so one thing that you'll want to do often as a developer in .NET is you'll want to install packages out there. For example, there's a library I like for testing called Bogus. It lets you generate a lot of fake testing data from whatever objects you're working with. And Bogus, you know, is great. It works on NuGet. The problem for us, though, is that we're on conference Wi-Fi, which is non-existent, and T-Mobile doesn't really get in here very much, so I can't tether. But there is a solution for that, because I can actually, you know, this line here, this #R NuGet Bogus, this would actually go out and install this NuGet package into my notebook, and I'd be able to work with it here. But I can also use #R ... DLLs and find it locally on my disk. So here I'm actually referring to Bogus that I have downloaded and saved to this workbook as well. And now I'm able to use it using Bogus, and now I'm going to create a faker to generate a new person and just generate random appropriate data. So here it generated a Marko Jacobski and a number of other people. And every time I run it, it's generating a new random person, which is really cool for, you know, test data. I'm just showing you A, because I like this library, but B, you know, anything that runs on .NET Standard, you can import, you can use using NuGet, you can just run it in here, right? So it's pretty cool. Now, I've not tried doing unit tests in a Jupyter notebook or a Polyglot notebook before. I'm not sure why I would want to try that. So I suspect I'd run into some issues. But you know, you can do a lot of the things that you would want to do here. But you're not going to be building a web server here in a Polyglot notebook. Please don't do that. Just to show you, we can do F# as well, because you know F# is a lovely, wonderful language for those functionally inclined. So here I've got a random case function I had Bing Chat generate for me. and it's got a nice little hello stir trek here. And so when I run this, it's actually passing hello stir trek into that function as you do for F#, and it's returning me the letters back in random capitalization. So it looks quite inebriated at the moment. And on that conspicuous note, I will take a drink from this. And I'm not going to tell you what's in it. Okay, so it's pretty cool. You can work with C#, F#, whatever your preferences are. Here's another one, Elite Speak Generator. So happy Revenge of the 5th, which is way better than May the 4th be with you. And it substitutes our letters as it can to, sound like a 4th grader or whatever. And of course, Lorem Ipsum. All of these, by the way, were generated by Bing Chat, which actually came out with some pretty decent code. But here I'm generating up to 140 characters of Lorem Ipsum just by invoking this function. And because I can't show you F# functions without chaining them together, here is up to 140 characters Lorem Ipsum piped into the Elite Speak function, piped into the random capitalization function. Dear God, what am I doing with my life? But there we go, right? Like Polyglot Notebooks and F#. Wonderful stuff. Now, these languages can talk to each other, just like they can talk to each other in standard.NET. If you have different projects, they can talk to each other. So here I've got a point class in C#, the same one we saw earlier, and the same point that we saw earlier. If I wanted my F# code to be able to look at the variables, I could share it. Actually, before I do that, I forgot to show you variables, so my apologies. Polyglot Notebooks also lets you see your variables. So the VS Code extension gives us this wonderful little thing here. So I can say, hey, here's my variable p. It's my point. This is what it looks like. This is where it came from. And it gives me this little actions thing. And this action thing actually lets me share it with another kernel. I can tell it what kernel I want. And that's going to generate a command that looks just like this. It's going to say set value into the C# kernel, or sorry, in the F# kernel, I want to get a value from the C# kernel, because technically speaking, .NET Interactive is actually like this umbrella of a bunch of different kernels that are all looking like one kernel. It's complicated. But we can say, hey, my F# kernel wants a value from C#. I want you to grab the variable p from the C# kernel, and I want you to bring it into the F# kernel using the name of pF#. And doing that, come on, demo gods. Hey, there we go. Doing that, I get this x of 4 and y of 2. It doesn't really look the same way as it did before. It's because I'm not taking a class and moving it from one language to another. I'm taking the data in the class. Remember, we are not taking logic from one language to another. We're taking data from one language to another. If you want to take logic from one language to another, well, do that in Visual Studio. We're able to take our projects and reference them already. Polyglot Notebooks is all about chaining data from one language to another. Okay? Well, my poor mouse seems to have left us, but that's okay. Trackpads will work. So this actually is a JSON document, and so we can get at something if we want by saying, hey, give me the root element, get the property x, and all that stuff. This, to me, is maybe the most tedious aspect of this. I would like to see some improvements to how we can more easily get data out from one language to another, because I think there's some opportunities for improvement, or maybe even just some helper libraries that can help with that to make the experience a little bit better. If we want to go the other way around, so here we've got a person class in F#. The person is named Bilbo Baggins. He is 11 years old. We can now share that with the C# kernel. And notice every time we declare a new variable or share a new variable, it shows up in our nice little list of variables down there. And then, of course, this is a JSON document. The downside of this is, if you're trying to share one class to another, well, your methods are gone. But your data is there, and this can help you get things from one language to another. So let's talk a little bit about that data. So here I've got SQL and KQL. I'm not even sure how you pronounce KQL, but it's a Custo Query Language. Okay? These are two ways of getting data out of things. So in this particular case, I have installed, using NuGet, the Microsoft.NET Interactive SQL Server package. This package lets me go in and work with things. By the way, this comma, asterisk, dash, asterisk, this is saying, hey, include pre-release versions. The version I'm working with here is actually pre-release. It's not formally released yet. So keep that in mind with what I'm showing you, but I do not expect the syntax to change for what we're doing. So using SQL Server, I'm now able to connect to a database. So I have a local database here running on SQL Express, and I am choosing to name this connection Polyglot Examples. This is actually going to create a new kernel in my in my Polyglot notebook called SQL-Polyglot Examples, and I'm able to refer to this later on. But everything that follows is just a connection string. So I'm giving it any connection string that's valid. I'm connecting to that database. And now I'm able to go down here and I can say, hey, using the SQL Polyglot Examples database, I want you to run this select statement. And I want you to store the result of it in a variable named SQL jokes. I'm actually querying a list of dad jokes that I also had Bing Chat generate for me. So here you go. If you're getting bored, why did the programmer quit his job? Because he didn't get a raise. Yeah, that's actually the best one that I got. But yeah, there we go. But when we ran that, that data got stored in a new variable called SQL jokes. Now, I'm not going to run this because I don't have internet connection. I can't download this. We'd see it down there in there. But we're seeing the historical results of running this with an internet connection. I can now share the result of that query into in this case, the C# kernel, and I'm able to now refer to this SQL jokes. This comes in as like a list of, it's a weird object. It comes in as like a list of key value pairs. It's not quite a dictionary. It's a little odd. But I'm able to loop over that. I'm able to go in there and I'm able to print out, here's all the jokes that we have. Here's all the things we can do here. Now, I don't know custom query language very much. It's a way of querying large data stores on Azure, at least. It might be beyond just that. But you can write, if you have a KQL query you want, you can run it about the same way as you could run a SQL query. And then you can take that data and get it out of there and get it into something else. Okay? So that's sort of what we see here. If you like PowerShell, you can use PowerShell. Here I have written a small web server that lets me query localhost 7041 IAM, and it's going to tell me results of doing a get there. It says I am Groot, apparently. If I do a post, I am Groot. If I do a put, to be maybe a little bit more assertive, I am Groot. But don't you dare do a delete, because then you'll get back, I am Groot. So I don't know PowerShell very much. This is about the only PowerShell I know. But you can make a REST request with this. And I see actually a lot of value in this if you just wanted to have a notebook that goes out and makes requests to something in a single line of code. It's pretty easy, right? But you could certainly use PowerShell for all the other things you're using PowerShell for. And that's just built right into a notebook, which is really cool. So here we go. So I wish I had a better example for you. I just learned yesterday more about like the full vision of this with D3.js. But here I've got a notebook. I've got some HTML in here. So you can put just HTML in your Markdown, and it usually works. And in this case, it works here. So that's cool. But you can also add in a code cell, like an HTML code cell. So here I've got a D3 target SVG canvas. So it's going to be able to render some SVG there. Now there's no SVG there, as we're seeing, so we just see an empty space. But now I'm able to run JavaScript. And this JavaScript, I'm able to go in here, and I'm able to find that D3 target, and I'm able to put in a circle. Okay, that's not very wow-inducing. But if we did a little bit more mental gymnastics and we imagined, Well, what if I had a SQL query that went out to my database and got my dad jokes? And then what if I had some C# that sort of aggregated that together or transformed it a little bit and then moved it into different configurations? And then what if I shared my results of that with JavaScript, and now I have some JavaScript that's going into D3.js, and it's running an interactive data visualization that we can then just play around with. That'd be pretty cool. Now, I realized that yesterday, and guess who didn't have time to write that for us for demoing today? But stay tuned for some more content. That's really the vision of this. So you can take data, transform it, and display it using whatever languages are most appropriate for what you're trying to do, and put it all in a single file instead of having to have like a web server for it and a database for it and all these things. So there's a lot of potential, I think, in a Polyglot notebook. One of my favorite things about it, though, is the Mermaid Diagrams. Mermaid Diagrams give us all these different ways of diagramming code. So you write Markdown to generate a flowchart. So this is some Markdown here that generates a flowchart. I sadly don't have time to show you all the different Markdowns for this because this is so cool, but I've written articles about each one of these things. I'll link you to them later. But here, I'm just writing some Markdown, and it shows the process of making a GET request from the client to a server, and the server's query to the database, and the trip back. So you can see how a diagram might help you really expand your documentation, right? So your documentation can really help out, get a lot of benefit from just some simple Mermaid documentation. And we're not storing an image, we're just storing the Markdown. So if you ever change your process and now you've got a caching server or whatever is going on, well, you just add a new node for it. And you check it into version control, and your diagram is automatically updated. You also don't need to worry about layout too much because you're saying, hey, Mermaid, I don't need a high-quality diagram. Just give me the best you got. Right? That's sort of the appeal of this to me because I'm a perfectionist. I want my diagrams to be perfect. This frees me from that and lets me focus on my content instead, which is really great. So it's got entity relationship diagrams, which I think is just fantastic. It's got the ability to generate a sequence diagram, which is really wonderful. So this is part of JAWS authentication is what I'm illustrating here. About anything you might want to diagram, there's a diagram for it. So here's a GET graph. So we can see, hey, here's what merging looks like here. Here's what's going into the next release. There's a lot of things you can do with this, which is pretty exciting. I spent 9 years in the project management software industry, so I was pretty excited to see Gantt charts make an appearance. But most people probably won't be as excited as me about that, and that's okay. I do some hobbyist game development from time to time, and I said, hey, can I make a state chart to show the finite state machines that my boss used? This is my game boss, not the person I report to at Tech Elevator, dear Kevin. Yeah, so I could diagram all of that stuff together with just a little bit of Markdown. And if it ever changes, I'm changing the Markdown. I don't have to go through generating a new image. It's just automatically generated for me. This is the stuff that I just fall in love with, that I nerd out with, and I spend weeks at a time writing about. So I wish I could show you a little bit more about how this stuff works. But this one actually, I love this one. It's the user journey map. It shows you, hey, how are users enjoying a product or service you're offering? And so here you're attending a tech conference. How happy are you with various parts? Who is involved in which part, and that kind of thing. It can really help you manage your products a little bit better. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with Mermaid charts. I think they're great. There are a couple ones that are formally supported that are not present yet in Polyglot Notebooks. I actually submitted a pull request. They've accepted it, but it hasn't made it into the latest build of the extension. So the next time the extension comes out, you'll get the ability to do a a mind map like this, and then I think timeline support I have as well. Yes, so there's some cool stuff going on with formatting here. So if you wanted to extend Polyglot Notebooks a little bit more, customize it, you have the ability to customize it. So let's say you had a rectangle class, had a width of 200 and a height of 50. Well, the default way of looking at that is going to show you all the properties on this object, and it's kind of helpful. But if you wanted to customize it, you could also say, hey, Polyglot formatter, I want you to go in and I want you to customize. Every time you see a rectangle as the output of a cell, I want you to instead use this SVG. Okay? And so now, when I show the same rectangle, I just see a little blue rectangle on the screen, which is great. And if I ever change my parameters of this thing, it changes to match it. So now note the order in which I run my cells matters there because I replaced the formatter and it's not going to get cleared until I restart my kernel. But if you had a custom object you wanted to generate a custom output for, you have that capability. The next bits of stuff really blow my mind. So here's an example they have of a custom extension they built for visualizing a date time. So they made an SVG clock out of this thing, and so anytime you say any date time, it just shows you a clock, which is great, with just the current time on it. And this next one, just as a professional educator, I love this so much. The Extension Lab project gives us a few new things, but one of them is something called explain code. So here I've got a cell that uses C# to loop up to from 0 to 42 and add those numbers to a list. Yes, I know I like that number. And by default, we're going to just see the array that was generated as the output of that. But if you add the new explain magic command that someone created in this DLL, instead, it sends this activity to the Mermaid kernel, and it says, hey, Mermaid, I have generated some Mermaid code for you based on what I've seen the person trying to do in this code. Please generate a sequence diagram for me, and that's what I'm going to show instead. So here I'm using this explain thing, and it's showing me a sequence diagram of what my code is doing. And so I could actually go out and remove one of those lines and update it, and the diagram would change. So this is really, really, really exciting to me because we are able to take we're able to write whatever custom implementation we want, and we're able to generate Markdown, send it on to Mermaid, or we're able to send it on to whatever we need to get the output that we're able to. So I'm super excited about that. That just blows my mind. I love it. If you're not a teacher, it might not make as much difference, but I think the power there is really interesting. This next one, I heard about this library last fall, and I forgot its name. I've been trying to remember its name, and yesterday I found it again, and I love it. There's this thing called Sandance from Microsoft Research, and it is a way of visualizing data. And if this library worked fine, I'd be able to show it to you here with an internet connection. So here I'm able to actually load up the CSV file from the Titanic here, and I'm able to see a nice little data frame just like I can in Pandas. And then over here would be a glorious chart. It looks just absolutely wonderful, doesn't it? It'd look great if I had an internet connection. However, I can cheat. And I've installed the Sandance extension for Visual Studio Code, which is also free, by the way. And now I can right-click in Visual Studio Code. You don't even need Jupyter Notebooks for this, by the way. This is just awesomeness. I can right-click on any CSV file. I can say View in Sandance, and boom, I get a nice data visualization of it. So I can say, hey, what's the age of somebody? So I can change that to maybe the passenger class. I want to say, instead of coloring by the cabin letter, I want to color by, did they survive or not? Let's sort it by their age. I think sorting by age is great. And then I can see all these cool little things, right? And I can even add in things like faceting. I could facet it by the sex. And now I can clearly see here, we see a few artifacts because I don't have like web icons out here. But we can see, hey, women and children first. It turns out there was a lot of consistency with that. Because if you were female, that's this left side here, and you were in first or second class, well, you tended to survive. You had this nice little green values here. If you were male, well, you didn't have that much of a chance unless you were below a certain age. Remember, these younger ones are going to be lower because that's how we sort here, right? And so we can really start to explore our data a lot. I am just in love with the Sandance. The way it animates is beautiful, and I'm just still playing around with all the things it can do. Not all of them make sense, but you know, it's still a really interesting tool to play around with, and again, absolutely free and great ways of just exploring the data that you already have available to you. So just another one of those things keeping me up at night because I really needed that. But I think getting simpler, getting more applicable to you, you can do a lot of just simple stuff by having your documentation and your code living together in cells in a notebook. You can have a list of things, you can interact with them. So here, actually I had Bing Chat generate this one as well. I'm like, hey, give me some fake documentation for how the list class works in .NET. And they're like, sure. And then I incorporated it into a notebook. And the nice thing about this is we get our documentation and we get our examples. And somebody who's learning lists for the first time can go in here and tweak with the examples and say, what happens if I do this instead? What if I do this in this other order and all that? And if they made a typo, well, they didn't break their whole application. They just broke one cell. And so the error is easier to find, right? There's a lot of things I love about this for teaching, but there's also a lot of things I like about this for team documentation and helping dev teams work together, new devs and experienced devs alike. And of course, I love my machine learning. That's what I do with my fun time. Ask me about Die Hard sometime. But yeah, you can do machine learning in .NET if you didn't know with ML.NET. So here is an automated machine learning pipeline I ran to classify video games. I'm basically training it on a bunch of historical video games, what ESRB rating they got, and then it's learning what's involved in those games, coming up with a good model in about 10 seconds, and that shows me the results. I'm glossing over the machine learning here because that's not my focus. But what I love about this as a developer is I can go in here and I can take a look at this result object, and normally I'd have to poke around with it in Visual Studio and just explore it and try to see what the heck is in there with a debugger, and it's just a pain. But I can just sort of expand things and poke around and understand things a little bit more easily just using a notebook because these visualizers are already really, really good. Okay? And I get the same tools I have for everything else for working with my notebooks. And I'm able to share this with my team. And in this case, I'm training a model. I'm evaluating its effectiveness. I'm saving it to a zip file so I can use it later on, deploy it on an ASP.NET server. Okay? I'm doing a lot with computer vision, and so I can use Azure Cognitive Services to just trigger things. So anytime, let's say that I have a scenario where people want to give me an image periodically and I need to analyze it, well, I can open up my computer vision notebook, install all the things I want to, and then I can go out and say, hey, here's the image I want to look at. So, it's my puppy when he was a puppy. He didn't want to leave my side even when I was coding in the evening. Now he's a little bit more independent. But I can call out to Azure Cognitive Services. By the way, don't try to use the keys here. I've already invalidated them in their endpoints. But I can go out there and I can see the results of this, and I can start to expand all these complex objects and say, oh, well, okay, I understand now. I see the structure of this object. I see where I want to go to get my data. And so I'm spending less time trying things and debugging in Visual Studio, and I'm spending more time just looking at the raw output and then saying, oh, if I want to get the caption of the image, well, I'm just going to go into description, captions, and look at the first one. It's a dog sleeping on a desk. Yeah, it's a good caption. Or looking at all these other tags or things like that. So I think that there's a lot of value to this stuff. I think it's so exciting. And the really great thing about this is Microsoft has only been working on this for about 2 years from what I can determine. This really kicked into high gear about last Thanksgiving with a big old blog post about it when they rebranded .NET Interactive to Polyglot Notebooks. But Microsoft is putting a lot of resources into this. It's only going to get better over time. So let's talk about how we might get started with this. If you want to get started with notebooks, I would recommend you do a couple things. First, I'd recommend you install VS Code if you don't have it installed already. It's free. It's going to be free. It's just a wonderful product. The second thing I would recommend you do is you go out to anaconda.com and you can install Anaconda. So you can download it for whatever operating system you're running, and that's going to give you a Python environment, well, Python in quotes because they kind of customized it a little bit. It's going to give you the dependencies that you need for a lot of things like Pandas and Plotly and all these other things. It's also going to give you some Jupyter Notebooks and Jupyter Labs. It's going to help you out a lot with that. Now, if you don't want to work with Polyglot Notebooks, you're done. You now have a Jupyter Notebook running, and it's going to do your job. If you want to work with Polyglot Notebooks, you need to also install .NET 7 SDK. That's also free, also cross-platform, of course. And then you're going to need to install a couple of Visual Studio extensions, the Jupyter extension and the Polyglot Notebooks extension, and that's going to give you this experience that I've been showing you here today. Okay? Again, this code is available for you if you want to go out and play with it later on. I have so much I want to write about all this stuff. I have so much more I want to share about all this stuff. If you want to be working with Polyglot Notebooks in a hosted environment, you can always install it into a Jupyter Notebook environment. But I think the future of this is really going to be something like GitHub code spaces running Visual Studio Code with Polyglot Notebooks already installed and things like that. But I am really excited about the range of possibilities, the things we can do, and how this helps developer productivity as we go on. I have a lot of content channels if you're interested. I write about artificial intelligence at accessibleai.dev. I write about software engineering at newdevsguide.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'll be tweeting these links out and everything. But thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy your conference. I'm here for questions. Anybody got one? What do you got? So your question is, what's the most effective way of getting a developer team up to speed with this right now and using it effectively? Well, I think you got to figure out what you want to try to do there, right? If you want to try putting your documentation there, your little experiments, visualization experiments, something like that, that might be your goal. What I would recommend you do is get everybody using VS Code for this and document that process first. Get people using it locally. See how they like it. Teach them the basics of, like, here's the cells and things like that. Here's how this works. And here's what we can do with it. Give them a couple good examples that provide easy value for things that they might be doing manually, and show them how that can help them. And then see where the team wants to take it from there. Right? This is something that can really grow within your organization, and it can grow particularly at the management levels as you start to get a lot of insight out of these notebooks. Matt, what you got? What's your question? Sorry. Yep. When you're passing language variables from language to language. Is there a way to pass behavior? No. I don't believe there's a plan to pass behavior along. Passing the data along, I'm not sure how that works. That works internally. Oh, now my mouse is working. That works internally by, where is the interop? So if we look at our variables here, you see the values in one thing to another. It's able to serialize the more complex things using JSON, I would assume, and deserialization there. I'm not sure exactly the technical internals of it. It is open source. I've looked at the code. I've just not looked at that code. If you have a more specific question, we might want to talk later. But I can also look into something or ask a question for you if you want. Just come chat with me afterwards. Yep. What you got? So the question is basically, Matt, your socks don't match. Matt, you're mixing together .dib files and IPy notebook files. Well, the difference between IPy notebook files and DIB files is I prefer the DIB files when I can because they're smaller in source control and they version better because they're not storing the results. But I am at the whims of the conference Wi-Fi and tethering and all of that good stuff here. So I needed to be able to show you some things without having an active internet connection, and so that's how I cheated to do that. Yep. Yep. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to technically answer that question. Let's chat later, and I'll get you an answer, okay? Okay, we're at time. I'm happy to chat afterwards. You can also send me some things on Discord, Twitter, LinkedIn. Folks, I really hope you enjoy your conference. It's a great place to be, and the movie's fantastic. I hope you stay for it. But enjoy your conference.